I will never forget the moment I realized my life had changed forever. I was 15 years old, standing alone in the vast airport, clutching my small backpack as if it could protect me from the crushing emptiness. My mother and her new husband, Victor, had walked away without even glancing back. One moment I was her child, and the next I was nothing more than an obstacle she no longer wished to carry. The terminal felt enormous and cold. The fluorescent lights reflected off the shiny floors, casting long, harsh shadows that seemed to stretch just for me. I could hear rolling suitcases, distant announcements, and the chatter of strangers around me, but the noise felt distant, almost unreal. My heart thudded in my chest, and my stomach twisted into knots I could not untangle. Victor had always loomed over me like a storm cloud. Tall, sharp, and impossibly confident, he filled every space with arrogance. From the day he married my mother, he made it clear that I was an unwelcome guest in their life. His smirks, his sighs, his constant belittling, every word cut me, every glance reminded me that I did not belong. And my mother? She watched, laughed at his jokes, even the ones that hurt me. I do not believe she intended to harm me, yet her inaction hurt far more than his words ever could. She chose him over me, and the realization was like ice down my spine. That morning, she had told me we were going on a trip together. Just the two of us, she had said. I remember the flicker of excitement in her eyes, the tone that sounded almost like love. For a moment, I believed she remembered me. I believed we could be a team again, the mother and daughter I once were. At the airport, she held my hand, but her grip was loose, distracted. Her eyes constantly searched for something beyond the terminal walls. I told myself not to notice, clinging to hope like a life raft. We passed through security, checked our luggage, and arrived at the gate. People were lining up, families hugging and laughing. My chest swelled with anticipation. I believed that soon my mother would turn to me with a smile, and we would board together. She leaned down and whispered softly, "Wait here for me, sweetheart. I will be right back." And she walked away. At first, I thought she would return quickly. Mothers do not leave their children. I waited, shifting from foot to foot, checking my phone repeatedly. 10 minutes passed, 20 minutes. My calls went straight to voicemail. Panic began to seep in, slow and suffocating. 30 minutes. 40 minutes. I felt the walls of the terminal closing in. My small bag felt heavier than ever, my hands trembling as I clutched it. That was when I found the note tucked between my things. It read, "Do not be upset. I need this time for myself. You will be fine." Fine? I was 15 years old, alone, abandoned, and yet she believed I would be fine. My throat tightened, tears burned my eyes, and for a moment I could not breathe. I tried to stand, to move, to make sense of it all. I called her phone again and again, hoping against reason that she would answer, that she would say it was a mistake. But no words came. Only the dull, cruel weight of reality. I watched the plane she was supposed to board and realized she was not waiting for me. She had taken a different flight with Victor, a luxurious trip, filled with champagne, sun, and laughter, while I sat abandoned, humiliated, invisible. The hours passed, the airport quieted, families reunited, couples embraced, children clung to their parents. I curled up on a stiff chair, hugging my knees, trying to make myself small enough to disappear. My stomach ached, my throat burned, my chest tightened. I felt the full weight of betrayal for the first time. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying every detail. Victor's smug smile, my mother's indifferent glance, the note she left, the footsteps fading into the distance. Anger simmered beneath the grief. The injustice of it all pressed down on me, relentless. I realized in that moment that hope was no longer an ally. My mother had chosen luxury and comfort over me. She had abandoned her child. But as the anger and sorrow mingled inside me, another emotion began to rise. a seed of determination, a quiet, unwavering promise. I would remember this. I would make her understand the depth of the pain she had caused. One day, she would see the consequences of leaving her child behind. Not today, not tomorrow, but one day she would pay. The moment I ceased to be her child, I began the journey to become her reckoning. That night at the airport was not the end. It was merely the beginning. The days after the airport were worse than the abandonment itself. I returned home to a house that felt foreign, even though it was the same place I had grown up. The walls seemed colder, the air heavier, as if Victor and my mother had drained the warmth from it along with the affection they had once shown me. Victor walked past me in the hallway, his smirk sharper than ever, as if he enjoyed seeing the weight of my humiliation pressing down on my shoulders. He did not speak. He did not need to. His gaze alone said, "You are insignificant here." My mother avoided my eyes, busy with her new life and the attention she lavished on him. I tried to speak to her, to ask why she had abandoned me, to plead for even a shred of understanding. She listened, but she did not respond with empathy. Instead, she said, "You are making this more difficult than it needs to be. We are trying to enjoy our life. You will understand when you are older." Her words felt like a blade sliding through my chest. I was 15. I was alone. And she believed that I should understand her decision. At school, I carried the invisible weight of my abandonment. My friends noticed my silence, my withdrawal, but I could not tell them the truth. How could I explain that my own mother had chosen a man over me? That I had been left at an airport to fend for myself? Instead, I became quiet, tense, and withdrawn. Teachers commented on my distracted gaze. Peers whispered, wondering why I seemed so distant. At night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling of my small bedroom. The memories of the airport haunted me like ghosts. The fluorescent lights, the note, Victor's smirk, my mother's indifferent glance. All of it played over and over. My body ached from tension. My mind raced with questions I could not answer. I wondered if she had ever regretted leaving me there. I wondered if she even remembered my face that day. I tried to talk to her again, over the following weeks. Each attempt ended in frustration. She dismissed my feelings, blamed my attitude, or simply avoided the conversation entirely. Victor reinforced the distance between us, offering subtle criticisms and ensuring that I never felt welcome in their new dynamic. I felt powerless. Every action I took seemed insufficient, every plea for recognition ignored. The helplessness gnawed at me relentlessly. I began to understand the depth of the betrayal. I realized that I could not rely on them for love or protection. At school, I became more cautious, more observant. I noticed how people underestimated me, assuming that my quietness was weakness. I saw opportunities in their assumptions. I learned to hide my anger beneath a calm exterior, to observe, to plan silently. But the pain never disappeared. It lurked behind every interaction, every lonely meal, every night I lay awake in my bedroom. I would sometimes replay the airport scene, imagining different outcomes. I wondered what I could have done to prevent it, even though logically I knew there was nothing I could have done. Yet even in that suffering, a spark began to grow. If they could discard me so easily, then I would find a way to reclaim power, not recklessly, not impulsively, but with careful thought. I would turn the tables one day. Every day became a lesson in observation. I watched Victor and my mother, noting their habits, their arrogance, their weaknesses. I learned to listen when they spoke, to read their expressions, and to record every slight, every condescension in my memory. It became a silent preparation, a mental map of the eventual reckoning. I remember one night particularly clearly. I had just returned from a late study session at a friend's house. I entered the empty living room, the chandelier casting soft shadows over the polished floor. My mother sat at the kitchen counter, laughing quietly at something Victor had said over the phone. I froze, watching their comfort, their careless joy. My chest ached with envy and anger. I felt small, invisible, and yet in that moment, a plan began to form. If they could enjoy their luxury at my expense, then I would find a way to dismantle it. I would find a way to show them the cost of their cruelty, and I would do it without hesitation. For months, I endured this tension. I suffered humiliation, isolation, and the persistent ache of rejection. But I also honed patience, learning that revenge is not born in fury alone, but in careful, deliberate thought. Every insult, every act of indifference, every moment of being ignored was a lesson, a brick in the foundation of my future plan. I began to write in secret, notes, observations, small sketches of plans, lists of vulnerabilities. I tracked Victor's routines, my mother's habits, even the smallest details they overlooked. I learned the value of timing, of patience, and of waiting for the perfect moment to act. By the time I reached 16, I was no longer the helpless child abandoned at an airport. I was quiet, observant, and calculating. My pain had not diminished, but it had transformed into focus. I carried it with me as a constant reminder of what had been taken from me and what I intended to take back. The nights were the hardest. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of injustice pressing down, imagining the moment when I would finally have control. Each sleepless hour sharpened my resolve. I knew that I could not act rashly. I had to wait. I had to prepare. And in that preparation, a thrill began to build. It was subtle at first, a quiet heartbeat of anticipation. I realized that the more meticulous I became, the more satisfying the eventual reckoning would be. I began to understand that power was not immediate. It was earned through patience, observation, and the careful accumulation of knowledge. The child abandoned at 15 was no longer powerless. The pain had made me aware, alert, and calculating. Every slight, every humiliation, every sleepless night was shaping me into something far stronger than they could ever imagine. I could not yet act. I had to wait. But when the time came, I would be ready. They believed they had broken me, dismissed me, and silenced me. Yet every moment of suffering, every sleepless night, and every memory of betrayal was quietly forging the tools of my revenge. Soon, they would discover that the child they discarded had grown into a force they could never ignore. When I turned 17, the ache in my chest had hardened into a steady, cold determination. Grief had taught me patience. Humiliation had taught me observation. The nights of staring at the ceiling had taught me to catalog details the way other teenagers collected music playlists. I began to treat my pain like a blueprint. Every slight, every careless word, every laugh I heard from the other room became not merely an insult, but a data point. Useful, precise, and necessary. I started small and secret. I kept a notebook hidden beneath the false bottom of my drawer, and I wrote down everything I noticed. The times Victor left the house before dawn. The brands of credit cards that arrived in the mail. The little phrases my mother used when she wanted to reassure herself that she had made the right choice. I recorded their daily rhythms as if I were mapping a city I planned to walk through later. The act of writing calmed me. It turned chaos into order. I learned how to look without being seen. I would sit in the kitchen while they argued about nothing of consequence and watch the way Victor flared his nostrils when he lied. I would stand by the window when my mother prepared her social events and listen to the phone calls that carried more than friendly chatter. I noticed the names she said more often, the businesses Victor mentioned, the people who called to congratulate them on investments. I started to understand where their wealth came from, and importantly, where it might be fragile. At school, I became adept at appearing ordinary. Teachers thought I was a quiet, hard-working student. Friends assumed I was distant because of teenage moods. None of them suspected that I was spending my free hours learning to read ledgers online, to understand basic financial terms, to interpret a spreadsheet with the same clarity I once used to read a book. I took night classes at the community center on weekends, sitting in rooms full of adults who wanted to learn how to manage money. I asked questions. I listened more than I spoke. Every small skill felt like a brick I could place in the wall between me and the helpless child I had been. Victor made mistakes. He always had. He loved risk and showmanship more than he loved caution. He would brag about deals in front of my mother, loudly and with too much certainty. He would flash documents with projections that sounded impressive, but beneath the numbers, lacked sound backing. He talked to the wrong people at the wrong time. He took shortcuts. These were the cracks. One evening, at about 2 a.m, I found a receipt tucked into a jacket he had left on a chair. It was a dinner receipt at a restaurant where he took clients. There was a phone number scribbled on the back. My heart beat faster than it had in months. I copied the number into my notebook. That is how the trail began. Small, almost trivial, but it led outward in a way a single drop of water creates ripples. I learned to be patient. Patience is underrated in stories of revenge. It is not dramatic in the moment, but it is the engine of every effective plan. I waited for the right openings. I studied their calendar. I watched the times when my mother left for charity events and when Victor traveled for business. I learned their security habits. Who forgot to lock the back door? Which of their friends were vain and talkative? Which of their acquaintances liked to show off? When I was 18, an opportunity arrived that felt like a door opening. Victor had been boasting about a new investment platform he claimed would yield quick returns. He had spoken of it at dinner parties, described it in grand terms, and even invited a few acquaintances to invest small amounts as a show of goodwill. He had used my mother as proof of success, asking her to say that he made their lifestyle possible. They would sit across from me sometimes, confident in their world, and raise their voices in a way they thought I could not hear. They did not realize I was listening the way a predator listens for the sound of an animal in the dark. I began to dig deeper. I created a simple false identity online. An email address, a social profile with a generic name, credentials that looked plausible but did not belong to anyone I knew. I signed up for newsletters, investment forums, and social groups related to the platform. I read through posts, comments, and promotional materials with the kind of intensity I used to reserve for novels that gripped me. Slowly, patterns emerged. There were whispers of delayed payouts, of accounts frozen without explanation. There were buried complaints that the flashy testimonials did not match the numbers. This is where the moral line can look blurry to someone who has not been abandoned. I gave myself permission to pursue what justice looked like through the lens of someone who had been discarded. I did not seek to cause harm for the sake of cruelty. I sought to dismantle a structure built on the presumption that money and image could erase responsibility. I wanted to remove the safety net they had used to justify leaving me behind. I started to gather tangible evidence. I printed emails with suspicious phrasing. I saved screenshots of comments that spoke of missing funds. I contacted a couple of anonymous complainants through the forums, listening to their frustrations and asking gentle questions. People do not speak freely when they feel exposed. They speak freely when they believe they will not be identified. My false identity offered that safety. They told me about the times the platform delayed withdrawals, about the executives who avoided direct questions, about elegant slides that hid fragile foundations. I found a whistleblower who had left the company. He was cautious and mistrustful, but he agreed to speak after I earned his confidence. He shared internal memos that referenced cash flow issues that had never been made public. He explained how the platform cycled new investor money into paying out old investors until the inflows slowed. It was not a complicated scheme, but it was fragile, and it relied on appearances, glamorous events, glossy brochures, and the faces of people like Victor who were comfortable in the light. Armed with the whistleblower's documents, I felt the first real shift from planning to action. I was not satisfied with anonymous posts anymore. I wanted a precise strike that would remove the props from their stage. I wanted people to look at Victor and see the man who built his life on fragile promises. The next phase was logistical and required an even greater degree of patience. I needed to be careful. If I acted too openly, I risked exposure and, more importantly, the plan's failure. I began to arrange small tests. A phone call to the platform's support line, masked to sound like a concerned investor, a request for documents that the company should have had on file, careful, harmless inquiries that did not directly implicate Victor, but revealed weaknesses in their public narrative. There were close calls. Once, while attempting to retrieve a physical brochure that the platform distributed at a hotel conference, I nearly ran into one of Victor's associates in the lobby. For a moment, my heart dropped into my stomach. I walked slowly, keeping my head down, and in that instant I felt the raw edge of fear. If I had been recognized, I do not know what would have happened. I could have been questioned. I could have been dismissed as paranoid. The risk of being uncovered was real, and the thought chilled me. But I also felt the electric thrill that comes when a plan is not purely theoretical. It can either freeze you or sharpen you. It sharpened me. I learned to hide my curiosity as skillfully as I had once hidden my tears. I became two people in one, the polite, dutiful child at home and the focused investigator in the small hours of the night. I learned how to use cash prepaid phones without leaving a trace. I learned to meet people in public places where no one would expect me. I sometimes lied to my friends about homework and late shifts when I actually sat in libraries reading legal disclaimers and annual reports. Every move I made had a purpose. I tracked the flow of money, the timing of transfers, and the names that recurred. I compiled a dossier not as an act of obsession, but as a record of accountability. I wrote notes in precise language, noting dates, times, and sources. I made copies of the whistleblower's documents and cross-checked them against public filings. Slowly, the picture clarified. Victor S. public bravado masked a foundation built on shaky promises and borrowing against future success. By the time I turned 19, I had enough to be dangerous. I had emails, screenshots, and testimony. I had a timeline of missed payouts and a list of names who had complained. I had traced certain transfers to shell accounts. I had proof that the glossy image they used in public was not backed by the paperwork that should have existed if their claims were legitimate. It was not an act of revenge born of malice. It was an act of exposing a house built on sand. The psychological weight of the plan at this point was enormous. I slept less. I woke up early. The intensity of focus made my hands tremble sometimes, and there were nights when the adrenaline left me hollow and exhausted. I wrestled with moral questions in the quiet hours. Was I becoming like them? Would exposing them ruin lives beyond what they deserved? I would sit and imagine the worst-case scenarios as a test of my resolve. If I could accept the possible fallout, then I knew I had to proceed. If I hesitated, if pity softened my edge, the plan would fail. One night, while I sat at the kitchen table with a stack of printouts, my mother walked in. She looked tired in a way I rarely had seen before. For a moment, she sat across from me and simply stared. I wanted to speak, to ask if she felt any shame. Instead, I kept my composure. I kissed the inside of my cheek and reminded myself that restraint was power. She asked me a trivial question about dinner, and I answered with a neutral tone. Her face softened, and she returned to the living room. She never asked about the papers. She never noticed the notebook beneath them. That small interaction reinforced something critical. I could no longer rely on her for understanding or empathy. The person who should have been my advocate remained oblivious. She had built herself a world in which my suffering did not register as a problem needing correction. If I wanted justice, I would have to construct it myself. I began to shape the final phase of the plan. It would not be a shout in the street. It would be a quiet demolition. The goal was clarity. Remove the illusion without collateral harm to innocent people. The method required timing. I waited for an event where Victor's credibility was most visible, a gala he had helped organize, where he would stand smiling before potential investors and friends. I scheduled my actions to coincide with that night. There were small rehearsals. I checked the venue layout. I planned how to introduce the evidence to the right people. Journalists who had previously covered minor complaints about the platform, a lawyer who had expressed concern in an online forum, and a former client who had been publicly vocal about being defrauded. I crafted a narrative that would be undeniable when presented as a set of documents and corroborated testimony. I also rehearsed the moment I would face my mother. Revenge is not merely about destruction, it is about closure. I wanted her to understand not only that Victor had lied, but that she had been complicit in leaving me behind. I wanted the truth to be unignorable, the evidence so clear that denial would sound absurd. The night of the gala arrived like a pressure wave. My hands shook as I slipped into a simple dark coat and an inconspicuous scarf. I was a ghost in a room full of light. My heart pounded, but I felt a composure born of meticulous preparation. I carried with me copies of documents, emails, and the witness statements I had gathered. I had arranged for a journalist to meet me in a quiet hallway just before Victor was to give his speech. I had given the journalist a secure folder and asked him to prepare a public piece. It took all the restraint I had not to perform victory in that moment. I walked among them, the laughter and clinking glasses like a soundtrack to my purpose. Victor laughed loudly with his guests, unrepentant and convinced of his invulnerability. My mother stood beside him, radiant in a dress that made her look 20 years younger. The sight of them together, laughing about the life they had chosen without me, made my vision tunnel. I felt the last pieces click into place. The journalist disappeared with the folder. The lights dimmed for Victor's speech. He mounted the stage, and the room quieted. He spoke with arrogance, weaving his story of success and future promises. People clapped politely. I stood at the edge of the room, and for the first time since the abandonment, I did not feel small. I will not reveal what happened in that hall here, because the moment deserves room to breathe, and the fallout for Part 4 will need its own deliberate telling. Still, I will say this. Years of quiet preparation and meticulous gathering had led to a single night that altered the balance. It was not brute force. It was precision. It was the result of transforming pain into purpose. I had arranged all the pieces. I had the documents, the witnesses, and the journalist waiting. The room listened to Victor speak, unaware that the truth would descend like an unignorable dawn. In a few moments, the illusion would fracture. The life they had built on charm and borrowed promises would begin to unravel. The room smelled of perfume and expensive cologne, of brass polish and warm candles. Laughter rose in little waves, polite and rehearsed. Victor smiled the way predators smile when the hunt is still far from sight and the table is set. My mother glowed under the lights, radiant and convinced of the life she had chosen. I stood in the doorway like a ghost and felt the years fold under my feet. Everything I had done, every quiet hour of research and every whispered conversation with strangers on forums, led to this narrow slice of time. The journalist found me in the hallway just before Victor mounted the stage. His face was all professional calm. His fingers were steady as he took the folder I handed him. I watched him walk away, watched the fat envelope of proof disappear beneath his coat. My heart pounded, but the rhythm was no longer panic. It was the metronome of someone who had timed each beat. Victor began to speak. He painted a future in bold strokes: expansion, innovation, trust. The room responded as he expected, applause and approving nods. He looked like a man who had beaten every obstacle. My mother beamed at him, and for a moment she caught my eye across the room. She smiled, a private smile that excluded me completely. I felt the old hurt flare, then subside into a curious cold calm. I was no longer begging for her attention. I was waiting for truth to step into the light. The first murmurs began like small insects. Someone near the back coughed. Then another voice asked a question not about the speech, but about recent rumors circulating online. Victor answered as he always did, grandly, punching the air with confidence. Then the lights snapped back on, and a voice over the speakers announced that the journalist had published a breaking report. Screens lifted around the room, phones, tablets, discrete laptops, and the headline blazed in bright text. The article did not scream. It stated facts in a voice of hard clarity. It presented emails with timestamps, screenshots of delayed withdrawals, the whistleblower's internal memo, and bank transfers that did not match public declarations. It laid out a timeline that looked unassailable because it was made of paper and pixels and names. The room fell silent. Victor faltered for the first time, his practiced smile cracking. People shifted in their seats, searching for one another's faces for comprehension, for denial, for confirmation. I watched him color drain from his face. He tried to speak, but the words came out thin, excuses dressed as explanations. Investors leaned forward. A few stood abruptly. I heard the clink of a champagne glass as someone put it down with more force than necessary. My mother's face went from bright to blank to a kind of stunned, fragile panic. She reached for Victor's hand like a child looking for comfort. People began to pull out their phones and call, whispering into them. I saw the expressions change. Confusion, then anger, then betrayal mirrored back at Victor in 1,000 tiny reflections. The gala turned into a room of people who suddenly felt misled. Conversations snapped like dry twigs. A reporter stepped forward and asked pointed questions. Victor's answers became shorter, defensive, then incoherent. He tried to maintain control, but the narrative had slipped from his hands and onto a page he could not erase. My mother found me in the crowd. For a moment, she looked at me as though she had only just noticed my presence. Her lips trembled. She mouthed something I could not hear. Her eyes searched mine, desperate and pleading. I felt a rush of old longing spike through me, but I watched it pass like a wave. This was not the moment for weakness. After the initial shock, the fallout accelerated. Partners withdrew. The firm that had underwritten some of Victor's deals announced an internal review. Social media picked up the story and ran with it. Threads filled with accounts from people who had been locked out of their funds, from small businesses that claimed losses after trusting him. His name was copied and pasted in forums and shared in private messages. The glossy image he had cultivated with photos and speeches collapsed under the weight of documents and corroboration. Legal notices followed. I sat up at 2 a.m. and read them with a strange, detached focus. A lawyer who had been following the journalist's coverage reached out. Regulators opened inquiries. The company's stock, such as it was, plummeted in a matter of hours. Victor's associates slipped away like smoke, retreating into quiet phone calls and closed-door meetings. The life they had constructed out of borrowed confidence and borrowed money shook and then began to fracture. The community's perception shifted as quickly as the weather. People who had once admired Victor's flamboyance now clucked their tongues and whispered about judgment. My mother's social circle narrowed like a dying flower. Invitations stopped arriving, and the glossy parties she once attended with him dwindled into hushed conversations at small tables. The same friends who had once toasted them now sent polite but distant messages, careful not to be associated with scandal. Reputation is fragile in a small city. It disintegrates faster than wealth sometimes. Victor did not look like the same man. He had lost his color, his ease. I watched him once in our living room, hands trembling as he paged through legal notices and angry emails. He spoke to my mother in a voice that sounded thin and frightened. He begged, not in full sentences but in looks and small gestures. My mother's face twisted with confusion, guilt, and denial. I did not move to comfort her. I had rehearsed my final lines, and the moment I would confront her in my head more times than I could count, but those rehearsals had strengthened me rather than softened me. When the creditors began to call, when bank holds appeared on accounts, my mother finally looked like someone waking up from a dream. Her hands flew to her face. I saw the realization hit her in a way that shook her body. She searched the room for answers, for someone to tell her this was a mistake, for an ally who would assure her that the illusion was still intact. There was no such ally left. People asked questions of me in the weeks that followed. Neighbors who had once nodded politely at family gatherings now paused longer when they passed my house, their expressions measured. I received notes from school counselors who wanted to ensure I was coping, from the journalist who had written the piece thanking me for my help and expressing professional admiration for the clarity of the documents. That last part made me wince. I had not done this for praise. I had done it because nothing else had been just in my mind. There were intimate moments I had not expected. One evening, a woman who had once been close to my mother came to our door. She had a softness in her eyes that surprised me. She would not meet my gaze at first. She told me, haltingly, that she had not known how badly things had gotten, that she had been blind to the signs, that she was sorry. Her apology felt sincere and small. It did not undo the years of neglect. But it was real, and in that small human exchange, I felt the complicated shape of justice. It was not only about punishment. It was about truth and about the quiet, corrosive power of reality to cut through comfortable illusions. Victor's public unraveling played out across months. He faced investigations, lawsuits, and a collapse of alliances. People he had once used as props turned away. He did not face prison in the quick, cinematic way that sometimes appears in stories. Life is rarely that clean. Instead, he faced a slow attrition, bank accounts frozen, businesses severed, and the hard, grinding erosion of credibility. He began to argue in the house more, blaming anyone who would listen. He tried to negotiate, to invent new narratives, to place blame everywhere but on himself. My mother listened for a time, then stopped arguing and began to cry alone in the nights. The emotional release I had expected when the first documents made their way into the light was not immediate and loud. It arrived as small, private exhalations. I would wake up and feel a lightness at the base of my skull, as though some tight cord had been loosened. I slept better. I walked with less of the careful hush that had once defined me. There were days when I felt anger flare again, soon followed by a tired emptiness. The satisfaction of seeing them humbled was complex. It was not a triumphant shout, but a measured, steady sense that the ledger had been balanced. My mother sought me out one afternoon, her eyes rimmed with red, her voice raw with something I had not heard in years: remorse. She spoke quickly, stumbling over sentences, asking for forgiveness, for understanding, imploring me to see her side. She told me about the pressure she had felt, about how Victor had seemed to offer stability, about the quiet erosion of her patience, and the slow slide into choosing comfort over challenge. Her words were true in the sense that they expressed a version of her reality, but they did not excuse the abandonment. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I felt a wash of memories rush through me. Bedtime stories, whispered consolations, and the cold note at the airport. I told her the truth. I told her that her apology could not erase the nights I had cried myself to sleep, the humiliation I had carried, or the years I had spent planning the right way to hold her accountable. I told her that I had done what I had done not to ruin her, but to remove the idea that she could cast me aside and expect to return when it was convenient. I told her that I had wanted her to feel the absence she had caused, to understand how real and lasting the damage had been. Her reaction was a picture of someone collapsing inward. She did not lash out. She did not plead in a way that would undo what had happened. She simply looked like a person who had been forced to confront herself in a mirror she could not cover. I felt no vindictive joy in that moment. I felt something harder to name. Acceptance, perhaps, or the hollow echo of a justice that had been served. There were moments of guilt, too. I had not wanted to see Victor ruined beyond redemption. I had wanted him to face consequences, and for my mother to wake up. And yet, watching the man who had once sneered at me ask for help and receive cold stares in return was bitter. I had to remind myself of the nights I had sat alone in the airport, the note burning in my memory like a brand. I had to hold on to the moral center that had guided me, that exposing truth was not the same as vengeance for its own sake. In the months that followed, the household shifted. The expensive vacations stopped. The late parties faded. My mother, when she left the house, no longer glowed. She carried herself with an awkwardness that suggested she had been unmasked. Neighbors exchanged looks, and invitations slowed to a trickle. We still lived in the same house, but the rooms felt different, quieter, more honest in a way that was almost painful. For me, the result was both closure and a new beginning. I had spent years as a person defined by abandonment. The act of reclaiming my agency did not erase the scars, but it placed them in a new context. They became the foundation on which I built a life that was not dependent on others' approval. I returned to school with renewed focus. I studied with a purpose that felt clean and unburdened. I found work that paid my own way. Each paycheck felt like a small vindication, a quiet declaration that I was not at the mercy of someone else's choices. On a quiet night, years after the airport, I stood on the porch while the house slept. I thought about the child who had curled up beneath fluorescent lights and the person I had become. I thought about forgiveness and whether it was owed or earned. I thought about my mother and the ways she had failed, and about my own hand in orchestrating a reckoning that had changed lives. Finally, I walked back inside. My mother greeted me with a tentative smile and an offer of tea. I accepted. We sat at the kitchen table, and for the first time in years, our conversation was not a performance. There was silence between us that felt like a truce. She reached for my hand, and I did not pull away. I spoke to her plainly. I said, "You left me at an airport, and you told me I would be fine. You were wrong." I paused. The air felt dense with all that had happened. "I am not the child you left there," I continued. "I am someone who remembers everything. I forgive you in the sense that I will not spend my life waiting for apology to heal me. But I will not let you step back into my life as if nothing happened." Her eyes filled. She nodded slowly, as if she understood the shape of my words. I left them to face their consequences and walked forward on a path I had carved myself. There was no triumphant music, no cinematic curtain call. There was only the steady stride of someone who had reclaimed dignity through difficult choices. Betrayal from a parent is a wound that does not heal by time alone. It is a wound that requires truth and sometimes action. I did not take revenge because I enjoyed the fall of another. I took action because their choice was a theft, not only of affection but of trust and safety. I wanted to restore balance, to name the harm, and to ensure that leaving a child behind was not a consequence-free decision. Justice, in my case, was not about cruelty. It was about accountability. When I reflect on those years, I do not celebrate ruin. I celebrate the discovery of my own strength. I celebrate the quiet, stubborn work it took to transform pain into purpose. The cost was real for everyone involved. The lesson was harsher but necessary. Actions have consequences, and the people who choose comfort over responsibility must answer for the harm they cause. The child you left at the airport does not live here anymore. If this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe for more true, hard stories of betrayal and justice. Share this with someone who needs to hear that standing up for oneself is possible, even when the odds feel stacked.